Empower your teams by turning data into action with Search AI. Arm your site reliability engineers with real-time insights, your security analysts with analytics powered by AI, and your developers with advanced search capabilities. Visit us at elastic.co to learn more. Elastic, the search AI company.
The problem with work is adapting to change. I've worked at Fast Company for almost 11 years, and in that time, we have always used Google Docs, kind of off the radar, an official way that we have worked on stories and calendars and ideas and all of those things. And as our systems change and get a little bit more buttoned up, we've started to transition to SharePoint, to more secure ways to communicate our information. And I am here to admit that it's been incredibly difficult for me to give up Google Docs. I am not alone. Adapting to this change at work, a change that sounds really small, has actually been really hard for myself and for a lot of my colleagues because we've just been used to doing things in a certain way for a very long time. The thing is, our SharePoint docs aren't actually that much different or that much more difficult. It's more a force of habit. I've been using Google Docs for so many years. I've been doing things in a certain way for so many years. I reluctantly started collaborating with Julia, our producer for this show, on a SharePoint document, and things got erased. And I used it as an example of, see, it doesn't work. I am going to hang on to my old way of doing things. I know that it is something that our company has decreed that we are all going to do, and I will eventually move over most of my communications to SharePoint as we are supposed to do, but I will silently resist. I think at the end of the day, there's a lot of different approaches to change, resisting it or embracing it, and I might eventually have to just tell myself to suck it up and deal with it. This is Fast Company's The New Way We Work, where we take listeners on a journey through the changing landscape of our work lives and explain exactly what we need to build the future we want. I'm Fast Company Deputy Editor Kathleen Davis. This season, we've explored some of the biggest problems with work: low pay, unfair hiring, loneliness, long hours, bad bosses, and we've talked about how to fix these problems. In fact, the entire premise for this show is that work is changing every day. Every week, I ask you to come along with me as we work to build the future we want. But there's a big problem that I've never really addressed. Change is hard. Change is as scary and uncomfortable as it is necessary. And now, more than ever, as AI is integrated into more of our jobs, we are asked to adapt to seismic shifts in a much faster rate than in the past. Change may be the nature of work and life, but it's also in human nature to resist it. So how can we make it a little easier? Are there ways to train our brains to become more adaptable? To help explain how we can become more comfortable adapting to change at work and in life is Dr. Sanam Hafeez. She's a neuropsychologist who has studied how our brains adapt to change. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
So let's start with why change is so hard for people, both emotionally and mentally.
Well, because our brains are hardwired to have either a routine or just some sense of predictability. So when you introduce a new or a novel concept or a new factor or a person or a new way of doing things, the brain perceives it as a bit of a threat. It wants to sort of hunker down and protect itself because it's worked so hard to establish a routine. And here you come with something completely new. And for many different reasons, it brings up a lot of emotions. And individually, those emotions may not feel like threats, but when you amass all of them, the instinctual feeling is one of the need to protect oneself. And this is why people resist change and take so long. In some cases, not so long, actually. It's funny because sometimes we can adapt very quickly. But generally speaking, the idea of change is usually worse than the change itself.
I feel like that needs to be embroidered on a pillow. The idea of change is worse than change itself. Like, oh, yeah.
Yeah, right? I mean, you all know it.
Yeah, it's like you know it's true and you feel it's true, but you naturally resist it. It's kind of fascinating. Can you tell me a little bit more about what happens in the brain as we adapt to change? I know I've read in some of your work about neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to adapt to new experiences. What's going on in our brains?
So, when we repetitively do a task or engage in something every day, the brain forms these neural pathways and they become kind of like second nature to us. The way we get up and brush our teeth, there was a point where our parents taught us how to brush our teeth and it seemed like hard work. And now we can do it, one eye closed. At least I do it one eye closed. These neural pathways are there to kind of help you go through the harder parts of life. When you introduce a new way of doing things, and let's keep it at, let's say, the idea of a toothbrush or brushing your teeth in the morning, going from manual to electric, going from regular flossing to water flossers, even that is a bit of a change because you're having to learn how to hold something and you want to make sure you're doing everything right and you're getting the crevices and you're really brushing your teeth. But now you're no longer using the old apparatus. And so you can apply that analogy to everything when you upgrade something or you change something. Even when it's for the better, the brain has to adapt and develop or upgrade those neural pathways. Think of like an iOS fix or an update, it's basically a software and the brain is learning how to have to do that again and create new pathways. Fortunately, the brain has, or seems to be increasingly with research and time, almost an infinite ability to adapt to change. And so the question is, why is it that we resist it so much? Because the brain's like, I can do this. But there's us or the emotional brain saying, no, this is too scary. Don't do it.
How does resisting change manifest? We talked a little bit about what's like happening in your brain. How does it manifest in behavior?
It can manifest as resistance. It can manifest in passive aggressively staying with the old tried and tested. It can manifest in anxiety and anxious behavior or even defiance in some cases. And it doesn't have to be overt defiance. It can be covert defiance, which is what I guess what passive aggressiveness can be. And it can be running away. It could be the fight and flight response. It could be saying, I can't do this. It's too much for me. And it depends on where this change is falling.
Mm. When we're talking about change at work, I think, and like using new systems at work, I think there is a lot of that. And I've been guilty of it myself of like, oh, but this old way of doing things worked. I'm just going to keep doing it, even though we're supposed to, change and evolve in this new way. Since we naturally resist it so much, but it's inevitable, how can we help adapt?
Well, there's so many different things that, we can do. But the main idea is how do we frame the change? Are we framing it as a good thing? Are we framing it as something that I have to do this? And if you're dragging your feet internally, you're going to drag your feet externally. If you're at a point where change is inevitable, getting to that acceptance part sounds like, well, it's easy, just accept it. And it's really not, because our ability to accept that something is no longer true or something is no longer going to happens at different rates for different people, depending on the situation. If you're very comfortable at your job, you've kind of like settled into a groove, you know exactly what to do, you go in. And even though there's no challenge, some people might be very comfortable with that because not everyone's looking for a challenge. Not everyone's looking to learn more. Maybe they have a very busy or full family life. Maybe work is just a way for them to pay the bills. And they're like, no, I get this. Why do I have to learn a new system or a new software, a new program? I think a lot of times people don't recognize that at work, change signifies more than just a new way of doing things. I think immediately a lot of people think, well, that means I'm going to be eventually out of a job. If they can do this, they're going to bring on more people, or this software is so sophisticated. What will become of my position here or my role here? And a lot of people don't stop to think about that. That underlying any reaction or any adverse emotion, fear is often the underlying sort of factor. It's what's driving it is the fear of scarcity or the mindset of scarcity or fearing that you're going to lose something, not necessarily gain something by adapting to change. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And that's interesting that you say that fear is what's underneath a lot of the emotions. Because I think about people who get angry at work and those sorts of defensive, like all of those things. And of course, the big underlying fear with AI is that it's going, the robots are going to take our jobs.
Yeah. And to some degree, it's a legitimate fear. I mean, look what Hollywood had to do last year. AI is able to use voice and visual likeness to mimic an entire person. I mean, as an actor, I thought to myself, oh, this would be terrifying. I think AI is changing a lot of things, but even before AI, anytime a business or your employer adds a new way of doing things, one of the most gut feelings is, what does that mean for me? What does that mean is going to happen to me?
Mm-hmm.
But we don't address that even to ourselves, let alone to someone else. No one ever says to their boss, what does this mean for my job? Is it safe? It's the same thing when your boss calls you in their office. You go, am I getting fired? No one walks in and says that, but almost everyone thinks it. So these are things that are not being said out loud, but that is the sort of the framework around it. And I think if people can accept that framework, then they can work toward a resolution because they know where they're coming from. A big part of handling change at work is really changing how you interpret the facts. And so when we get scared of something, our immediate reaction is to think of the worst case scenario or assume something which very often may not be true. And when we do that, because we don't want to hear the rest of it, we don't ask questions. So framing the interpretation of what we think is happening and clarifying it by asking questions are two of the easiest ways to get facts on the table. And a lot of times, because of that underlying fear, we don't want to address the actual, elephant in the room.
That's great advice for an employee if they're feeling comfortable and brave enough to, as you say, kind of put your cards on the table. From a manager's perspective, how can they help kind of ease transitions to change and maybe calm those fears before they take place?
I think a manager's role can be really critical because they can sort of preempt the fear or the concern of security and say, this is what's happening. If you're the kind of manager that has a reputation for being honest and truthful and your subordinates trust you, then they know that you're not, basically BSing them, right? They know that they can trust you, that your information is accurate, that you're protecting them as much as you are protecting the company. And I think that's a big part of the problem with managers. And as a small business owner, I can tell you that a lot of times the issue that I've had with managers is that exactly it. That people don't know who that manager, that person's really loyal to, or who's priority for them. I fortunately right now have an amazing manager who manages to walk that fine line, but I think it's a very difficult job. And so I think if a manager can say, look, this doesn't mean anything's going to change with regard to, let's say if this is going to be true. You don't want to be dishonest, but there's not going to be any layoff. We're not looking to replace you. We're looking to make your work easier so you can do a little bit more of this because we want to add on, this is going to bring on more business. This means that your jobs will have more longevity. This means that you're learning a new skill that will add to your CV, but also make you more valuable or more of an asset to the company. And if you word something where an employee can feel like, okay, I'm safe, then they will listen and process the rest of the information. But as long as you stay in that fight or flight mode, you're not processing factual information. They're saying one thing, you're hearing something else.
We're kind of coming at this with the assumption that not only is change inevitable, but that the changes that are being made are good. Not all changes are good. Is there a way for organizations, managers, employees to, first of all, maybe determine whether the changes they are making are for the best and to kind of come at it from more of a collaborative perspective where it's not the management saying this is the change that's being made, you adapt or die, basically, and that the employees kind of have more buy-in in what changes are taking place?
Yeah, I mean, there are ways to do it. See, a lot of times I think people, and I've been a business owner for pretty much my entire, well, I wouldn't say my entire life, but for the last 18 years, which is a long time. And so I can't speak for the big corporate world, but I do work with people in the corporate world. I have family and friends who are in it. And it seems to me, and I think the tide is turning a little bit, but only for the more the big companies, the more affluent, maybe financial companies or companies that manage data. But I think for the most part, change is always handed down from the top to bottom, which is okay because management can decide things. It's okay. It's their responsibility. And so they can decide what changes need to be made. But I think a lot of people, especially in larger groups, feel that they are blindsided by the change because there's no communication. And so maybe if management sent out an email or some literature that we're considering signing up, or we've been in talks with this company and they're introducing this new program or this new software, and we'd like you to take a look and give us your feedback. I think that would work remarkably well because this way there's an email. So there's a slight sort of indication that change is coming, but it's not being dropped on you. And they're asking for your feedback. Now, whether they take that feedback into account or not, but it's great when people can feel that they have a say in the process. And that's the buy-in, right? So emotionally buying into your job is the same thing as emotionally buying in to a relationship. It's the feeling of having a voice. It's the feeling of being heard, but also what are you bringing to the table? And your feedback is really as valuable as your work because it shows your level of investment in the company.
That's such a great point. And I think, to take that a little bit further, probably then would make the individual evaluate, why. If they're saying, no, I don't want to use this new system, you have to kind of, if you're giving feedback, you have to give an actual logical reason. Yeah. As opposed to, well, I just don't want to.
Yes.
I'm comfortable doing what I'm doing. Yeah.
Yeah. And it forces people to think, why don't I want to change? What is it about this that I don't like? And it forces them to think about it without going into that protective, hunker down, fearful mode where they're thinking, oh, this is bad. This change is going to be bad. I don't want to do this. And so because they don't necessarily see that as a change being imposed on them, they see that as a, hey, what do you think about this? Even if the change is going to be imposed anyway, because you enter the conversation as a collective, it feels less like a command rather than a suggestion.
Yeah, exactly. And that can make all the difference. And, on the other side, on the management side too, if it is just something like, oh, well, everybody's doing it, everybody's adding AI, let's add some AI without really thinking through it. And you get some critical and good feedback from your employees, maybe if this is the best system for you to start using.
Exactly. And I think, the funny thing is that psychology, the human psychology, the way we function is the same in relationships. And similar to how it is at work, right? Because we're still the same person. It's not like we literally put on another hat. Yes, we don't have to be the same person at home and at work, right? And completely accurate. But we don't change on the inside. So the majority of people have a sense or fear of being replaced. And it's true in most people in relationships, and it's true at work. And with the workplace changing so rapidly, like this isn't the time of, the 60s or 70s where people stayed in the same job for 10 years or 15 years, 50 years, and retired from there, right? Like you never hear that anymore. Yes, there are more opportunities and things out there for people, but for older folks who are being replaced by younger people coming out with these college degrees and understand so much more about the technological world, it can be a very threatening place to be.
I'm glad you brought up the generational aspect because I would love to hear your thoughts on it. I kind of have some thoughts of my own of the belief that older people, boomers, Gen X, have a harder time adapting to change in the workplace than Gen Z, millennials, learning new technologies. Is that a stereotype? Is that true? Is there something to overcome that?
It's inaccurate is what it is because
I take that stance too that I don't think that that's accurate.
It's completely inaccurate. But this is exactly the psychology of one person always thinking that the other has all the answers and knows everything. Gen Z is by far struggling so much emotionally, psychologically. A critical 3-4 year part of their development was rooted in the pandemic. Depending on where they were in their 4-year journey, they either lost out in high school or they lost out on the early part of college. And the economy was such a disaster in the first couple of years. And it's just beginning to find its footing. And so Gen Z has a lot of other problems emotionally, psychologically. The only constant in their life has been social media or Snapchat or communicating like this. being in the workplace can feel very threatening for them because you have to look at people, even if you're on a Zoom call, you have to talk to people. You can't keep your camera off all the time. These were kids who were in school and never turned their cameras on. That is a lot more challenging than people realize. The amount of social anxiety that is rooted in being at work, in the workplace, making eye contact, having to have conversations with people of different ages because you're no longer in school is very challenging. And so the older people, and by older, I just really mean like 30s, 40s, 50s, really don't understand that because they forget what it's like, what it was like even for them. Whatever time they entered the industry, it was scary. You were getting coffee for people who seemed very threatening and scary. And then a decade or so later, you are that person and you're like, oh, that's scary, but that's not how the newcomers view you. So I think that's one aspect of it. I think the other aspect is that even for the very new, younger people coming out of college, the technology is changing so fast that they're also having to keep up with it. But what they don't have, that the older generations have, is experience in problem solving and communication and social skills. And there's a little bit of a toss-up. And I still think the older generations have an added advantage because they had to learn how to do things without so much technological help. And the younger folks, these kids, essentially, really, they have Grammarly, to fix their spelling mistakes and errors. And I'm from the generation where I could not stand that squiggly line and I had to go back and write it till I got rid of all the squiggly lines.
Yeah. And thinking about the cliche that boomers especially are like old fuddy-duddies who can't adapt to technology and don't know how to, use technology in a way that younger generations do. When I was thinking about it a little bit more, I thought, well, if you've been in your career for 30 years, 40 years, you have worked before the internet. You've already had to adapt to so much change. So even though, maybe Gen Z millennials are more digital natives and more comfortable around technology, certain types of technology than the older generations might be, the older generations maybe have that advantage of having adapted to change many times over.
Absolutely, 100%. That is so on point that their brain has had to adapt almost like, that picture of the Neanderthal, like standing up eventually. That really is how I see the last, 3 or 4 decades. We went from typewriters to word processors to the basic computers to the internet and laptops so fast. I don't think at any point in history has anything evolved that quickly and that sophisticatedly. And so, yes, the older people, boomers included, I guess, have really had to make a lot of change. And because the change came in some ways slowly and in some ways in this rapid fire speed, their brains adapted to the point where really nothing phases them anymore. I think the younger generation really didn't have to adapt that much. They were born into a time of the internet and phones and iPads. And I used to talk about this a lot, that when, let's say, a kid 20, 30 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, used to come home and wanted to make themselves something to eat and mom wasn't home. If, I guess 20 years ago, guys, I'm like losing my train of thought, like 20 years ago, it's like maybe 2004. I don't know. I don't think there was much of the internet. There was the internet.
I know. But, I still feel that 20 years ago was the 90s, but turns out it was 2004.
Yeah, I know. That's why I had to do a calculation. So they, maybe they had like a website or, whatever, but they didn't have it in the palm of their hand. A lot of times I remember cookbooks on like my mom's shelf. And so you went in and you looked something up or you read something in a magazine or you read something in the newspaper and you made something or you experimented and you made something. Well, guess what that does to your brain? It engages so many parts of your brain that it grows your brain exponentially because you're experimenting, you're trying different things, you're reading, you're imagining, you're measuring. Now recipes, videos, or how fast they go, in some ways it's fantastic because my 9-year-old's doing like dessert contests from watching YouTube shorts. And it's amazing, but it's not engaging a lot of their inner mechanisms, so I'll tell him, I'll go, honey, look, this is a measurement cup and this is an ounce. And so like they understand the concept, but they've never had to apply them before. And so I think the difference between a kid back in 2000, even 2004, and in 2024 it's engagement of the brain. And so the brain doesn't develop problem solving, critical thinking. How do I substitute this for this kind of skill, which is really what life is made up of, thinking quickly on your feet and figuring things out. And the internet and the constant, whatever microphone, Alexa, Siri, whatever you want to call it, can hear whatever we say. And even when we don't ask for it, there's an ad on our phone telling us that we need to be looking into this. So it never gives us a chance to really think for ourselves anymore. And so for the older people, it's okay. They've developed a lot of those strategies and coping skills, but the younger people haven't, and they may never develop them to that extent.
It's the same thing of, or a similar thing of writing by hand, forces you to slow down and kind of pay attention more than typing.
Yeah, exactly.
We've talked a lot about change in the workplace, obviously. I'd love for if you have any examples of companies where change has gone over well, or on the other side, how change went poorly.
So, as a clinician who's a business owner, it's really been walking a fine line between being an entrepreneur and doing the hard business stuff, but also really being a clinician and wanting to just see patients and serve the greater population. My trajectory has been very, very organic. Being in New York City, starting out with a small business while I still had a job at a hospital was really like, I'm just going to do this to make a little bit of money on the side. And then it exploded and became a much bigger thing. I literally took one of my parents' homes and converted that into a clinic, like a commercial space. And it got to the point where, there was just no room for people to sit because it just ran out of space. And I got contracts with the city of New York. And at one point I had 100 contractors, and it became just too big a business very quickly. And because I wasn't just a business owner, I was actually seeing patients. A lot of the nitty gritty of running a business really fell by the wayside. And I'm amazed that it stood the test of time. And then, I got pregnant and I was going to have twins. And the big contract that we had with the city of New York was really faulty and money wasn't coming in on time. And I had to make a very strong decision about just cutting them off entirely. And it's a huge income source. I said, that's it. You guys are done. I can't come back to work to find that, the lights can't stay on because you don't pay us and we're going to go private. And I sat down at the time and I had a conversation with the people who worked for me. And I said, look, guys, things are going to change. I'm going to have 2 little babies to take care of. And I'm worried that I can't be here all the time and I can't work 12-hour days anymore. And so we're going to go on a limb and believe that we have a genuinely good service and people are going to come. And in doing that, I bought a much bigger space in Queens and we moved in and we've never looked back. But a big part of that was, and I say this all the time, is if you can remember to focus on the service and the people.
Do you have any advice for somebody, say, who's in a workplace and, the change has gone through, they disagree with it, they're, really resistant to it, they don't think it's a good idea, but everybody's kind of like, you have to go along with this anyways?
Yeah, I'm sure there's always, especially when the change is really big or difficult, I think there's always going to be someone who is going to have a harder time with it. And, as a neuropsychologist, I have a real, a softer place than most people because I understand that the brains are just so complex and some of us have strengths and weaknesses that are so different from other people. So if someone's a really, let's say, a left-brained person, which, by the way, the majority of the population is not necessarily left or right brain. They're like all brain, but there's some people who have a very strong, and because I do this kind of testing every day, I can tell you that I see people who have a very strong dominant side. And so what I tell them, it's almost like the other side is just fighting to catch up with the other, right? So if you're a very nonverbal person, you're an IT guy, and suddenly you're thrown into having to make weekly presentations or run meetings, that is just not your domain. This is not what you do. And so asking someone to do something that they're not designed or wired to do, I think is also another place where I think the management system kind of goes awry. For instance, I'm a big fan of saying, utilize your resources in the way they were designed. So people who are designed to be computers, they're very good at computation to figure things out, mathematical. Give them that stuff. When you put them in an area that is challenging or threatening to them, you're just not going to find a lot of success because they're not going to be happy. Every day is going to feel like a challenge. And eventually you'll lose that person. So now you've wasted your time, their time, the company's time. And so if you have someone who's truly that resistant, I think the much better way to approach it would be to sit them down and have a real heart-to-heart. What about this is threatening to you? What about this scares you or worries you? And you'd probably find a lot more at the bottom of it than just the new task. I think I was dyslexic, or I think I have a learning disability. I have attention problems. I learned the old way of doing things and I finally got it down. And now you guys went and changed it on me. A lot of people kind of miss that human part of why people resist change. And then you could say, all right, you know what? There is this one aspect of it that you might be better suited for. How do you feel about doing more of that and less of this? Maybe we can pair you up with someone who really gets it. And then let's talk again in a week or 2 weeks. A lot of times people honestly just want to feel supported. They just want to feel heard and seen.
That's great advice, especially kind of critically looking at the change too. And as you say, is it something that is not within the person's skill set or inclination for how they work? And that's all for this episode. If you're a new listener, be sure to subscribe to The New Way We Work wherever you listen. And if you like this episode, leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. We want to hear from you. Work is changing every day. What's the most pressing issue on your mind? Email us at podcast@fastcompany.com. The New Way We Work is produced by Julia Shu, Avery Miles, Blake Odom, and Joshua Christensen with editing by Nicholas Torres.